You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 323 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about Congress passing a Yemen War Powers Bill that uses the Constitution to end the U.S. involvement in Saudi Arabia's war against Yemen. One of the most important issues I could be talking about really here, as millions of Yemeni people are just on the brink of starvation. There's a brutal air war going on in that country. The humanitarian crisis is continuing to grow and expand. And this is one way to try to bring some peace and stability to Yemen. Share the show or recommend it to someone. Best place to find it online is at the Libertarian Institute. I publish my daily news roundup and the show there. So the URL is libertarianinstitute.org. I know that site's been having some recent trouble with the server, but there is another place to find my work online, and that's at the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus website. They don't run all the things I do, but they end up publishing most of it, so you can find my work there as well. If you really want to support the show, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Donate and get access to some bonus content. All right, so starting off on today's show with the Yemen War Powers Bill. The great news is that this thing passes the Senate, 54-46. There's an awful lot going on, like kind of behind the legislation and in the details here that I want to explain, and then why it's so important. So I'm going to really take the time to break all this down. First of all, this is the legislation SJ Res 7 that was initially introduced by Representative Sanders, Murphy, and Lee. Now, most people will initially notice that Senator's Rand Paul name wasn't on the list, and that's because he had one problem with the legislation, and that was that the legislation didn't kind of specify what was going on because there's multiple wars going on in Yemen. So the subject of the Yemen War Powers Bill is Saudi Arabia and the UAE, in coalition with a few other Arab countries, are waging an air war and a blockade of Yemen, and then supporting proxy forces in the Yemeni government. And their enemy is a group known as the Houthis that are largely made up of a group of Zaidi Shia from kind of the highland area of Yemen, but has really, since encompassed about 80% of the Yemeni population within the control of their area. And while it's easy to call this a war against the Houthis and, kind of just thinking that that means the Zaidi Shia and, them being the proxies of Iran, it gets a little bit more complicated because a large portion of, that fighting force, and I'm not sure what the numbers are here, but there certainly is a lot of support from some Yemeni tribes that are not Zaydis to the Houthis. And so it's not as simple to just say as that, that this side is just the Houthis, just like it's not as simple to say it's just the other side is the Saudis. The second war in Yemen is the drone war that the U.S. conducts against AQAP and other jihadist groups like ISIS in Yemen. And that war was not mentioned in the legislation. Rand Paul wanted a specific statement saying that this legislation has nothing to do with that war. It doesn't authorize it. It doesn't turn it off. It's just irrelevant to it because he knows how the war hawks work and they take every inch they can. And so then they'll argue that because this legislation deals with Yemen and specifically doesn't say the U.S. has to stop conducting that war, that means we could continue to conduct that war, and it's an authorization actually for that war. In amazing news, and I was very surprised by this, Rand Paul actually offered this as an amendment, and it passes and is now part of that legislation. So that this Yemen War Powers bill gets even better as far as I'm concerned. While we're talking about amendments, it's also worth noting that Senator Inhofe attempted to really kill or strip this bill of all of its teeth by offering an amendment that said if a group is using missiles, then that, kind of Saudi-led coalition that the U.S. is a part of fighting in Yemen, the U.S. could then support it. And so because the Houthis use missiles, then, that somehow authorizes the U.S. to continue this war. It was just kind of a crazy loophole that will allow the war to go on. Now, of course, Senator Inhofe isn't, I guess, very concerned about the Saudi bombs, that they drop on Yemeni cities, because if so, then it would seem the U.S. could take action against Saudi Arabia by this amendment. However, it ends up failing. So it looks like a pretty decent, bill, actually, that ends up here coming out of the Senate. All right, so now here's some of the, I guess, complex legal procedural stuff going on. For those of us who are educated on what happens, how a bill becomes a law by Schoolhouse Rock, the I'm Just a Bill song, you just throw all that out that window because, really that's just a load of propaganda. What happened was the House introduced a version of this bill and then attached an amendment to it that was either a condemnation specifically of Representative Ilhan Omar, or because of some statements they made, it was kind of a sweeping condemnation of anti-Muslim, or anti-Jewish rhetoric. And then the Senate parliamentarian had ruled that, since that happened, then, the Senate's version of that legislation loses its privileges because, by the way we read the War Powers Act, I guess the bills had to mirror each other. And so there is, now some difference in the text of the legislation passed by the House and the Senate. I'm not quite sure how this gets resolved and what actually is the text of the legislation that ends up on the president's desk. But a lot of the reporting I'm seeing is saying that, this bill is going to end up on the president's desk now. Now, somehow the president is able to veto this. It doesn't seem right, from a constitutional perspective to say that the president could start a war without congressional approval, which is the way it has to start per the Constitution. And then it takes a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate, so in both separate houses of Congress, to overturn that. That really seems insane and not what the founding fathers, original intent of the Constitution. But, that's really, I guess, where we stand today. And if we look at the numbers from both the House and the Senate, they're not at 2/3 in either. We see here in the Senate, they're about 12 votes short, which is a lot to overcome, especially since I believe about all the Democrats are already signed on and voting for this legislation. So this is definitely a victory. However, I know that everything I've just said in the past 5 minutes or so may seem like there's just more and more obstacles to overcome. And that's definitely, the way I felt during the whole, kind of time I've been doing the show and following the Yemen war. It's been going on for almost 4 years now. That, there's steps going forward. I mean, they were getting votes first on, war power bills, or Rand Paul was holding up weapons sales to Saudi Arabia and demanding votes. And, eventually you have a House version of the bill, making it, to committee and then, being stripped down, but a lighter version, a broad rebuke of the policy passes. And then, one day the Senate passes, the War Powers Bill, but oh no, we're at the end of the term and the House won't take it up. And, there's been all these obstacles and they've slowly been overcome, and yet the war is still going on. And so I know it, let's bleak in that way, but, getting closer now, the legislation, I guess, is now going to make it to the president's desk. And while this is certainly a step in the right direction, and I think we could look at a lot of positives, like, the more congressmen that vote for this, I think, they probably represent a broader support from the American people against this. And hell, even if a congressman soaked in the money of weapons makers is willing to vote against a war, then, they must, really be starting to understand how bad this thing is. But another bad piece is, I think, had, this been passed within 30 days of the start of the conflict, it probably could have really helped to end the war very quickly, as Saudi Arabia was extremely reliant on the Americans at that time. Now, since then, it seems like, the Saudis have probably understood that, hey, if America ends their mid-air refueling support, then it's really going to limit our capabilities to carry out this war. And so, since the start of the war, I believe the Americans started actually training the Emirati Air Force, which is part of the Saudi coalition, in these mid-air refueling missions, which are pretty essential to Saudi Arabia carrying out their bombing campaign in Yemen. So now, even if the U.S. does withdraw their support, the coalition now has more capability to carry on this war without the United States. Now, from all the analysis I read, and I don't actually claim to possess the ability to really understand how essential the U.S. support is to the Saudi coalition now. But I still hear people say, within a few months of the U.S. withdrawing all their support, this war will, start to dry up, and it'll really limit Saudi Arabia's ability to carry out the war. I'm sure there's going to be some complexities around weapon sales to Saudi Arabia after this bill is passed. I'm guessing this isn't going to prevent like Patriot missile sales to Saudi Arabia or the sale of some ships that we have lined up. But, maybe we could start to talk about stop selling bombs or small arms to Saudi Arabia there, either being used or funneled into Yemen. So the really bad news is that we're still at best, months away from, I think, things getting any better for the people in Yemen. And, even I think from reading about war zones, one of the things I've realized is that, there's all kind of little complexity and things that are thrown off here. So, bridges are destroyed, roads are destroyed, tribal balances and other local disputes that may have like some kind of more or less settled agreement or, balance get thrown out of whack as, different people are bombed and killed. And so there's going to be, an awful long road for the Yemeni people after this thing ends to life really getting better. But when we're looking at a situation now where I think over 80% they're saying of the Yemeni people are in need of some kind of humanitarian assistance, whether that's food or medicine. They're saying now 15 million people are really getting close to that famine level. There's certainly already Yemeni people within what the UN says are famine conditions. It's really hard to say right now, and I'm always skeptical to give numbers of, how many children in Yemen are starving to death and dying because of this conflict. And one of the sad things is you probably won't ever be able to kind of count and attribute all these deaths, but, who knows, tens of hundreds of thousands at this point. Of course, we do know from ACLED that the death toll is likely in the 70 to 80,000 range of civilians being killed by this conflict. And not all of those are from Saudi bombs and from the U.S. supported side of this war, but a very large number are. One of the real problems with this war, and it's something that I've talked about that happens on the other side of the Red Sea here in Somalia, is that Saudi Arabia is really just able to drop bombs on Yemen. They haven't been able, as far as I could tell, to conduct any successful ground military operation with their own forces against the Houthis. And in fact, from, looking at maps and reading what local reports come out, the Houthis are much more likely to carry out kind of these cross-border operations into southern Saudi Arabia. And so even if Saudi Arabia is, let's say, able to bomb the capital city or bomb Sadr, the stronghold of the Houthis, they have no force even possible, coming in to secure this territory. And because, I think the Houthis have largely become the army of a lot of people in the territory that they control, carrying out airstrikes in these cities without being able to come in and secure the territory is doing nothing to help Saudi Arabia or, move closer to winning this war. Like I said, just like the U.S. and Somalia, we could, blow up or claim to blow up as many al-Shabaab fighters as we want. But I mean, at the end of the day, if there's no Somali national government able to come in and provide, security and a government for the people, al-Shabaab will continue to exist and thrive. Another big problem is, just that because this is a solo almost air war from the Saudis, as I think their fighting force in Yemen is pretty small. They've used mercenaries from Sudan. And from the way you read this, it really seems like it's borderline slavery here, as the Sudanese people don't have a whole lot of, stake in this fight, and their government is being paid by the Saudis for them to go over there and fight. And there's conscription in Sudan, so I'm guessing that there's an awful lot of Sudanese men who really don't care at all about Yemen being forced to go over there and fight on behalf of the Saudis and end up getting killed. And so, with, the very little fighting force they have, even with Saudi Arabia's overwhelming air power, because the Houthis have no air force to speak of, they still haven't, made any advancements in several months, but no significant advances have been made in 4 years. I mean, if you look at, the capital city still being controlled by the Houthis, the city of Hadada still controlled by the Houthis, the city of Taiz still controlled by the Saudi coalition. But, all these major cities that are kind of on the borderline of fighting or, centers of the air campaign have remained in the hands of the same side for the past 4 years. A real problem here is that this war has benefited the AQAP and ISIS jihadist types in Yemen. One way is, of course, through just the power vacuum. The Houthis are the enemies of the jihadist groups. And with everybody's attention turned in bombing the Houthis, it created a real outlet in, area and space for AQ and AP and ISIS to thrive. It also, I think, created the conditions on the ground in Yemen where they were seen as valuable fighters. And so now they have ended up in the ranks of the Saudi and Emirates ground forces in Yemen and are, using U.S. weapons and fighting against the Houthis. But who knows, what happens to those weapons in the long run. It's also created situations where, the Emirates have agreed to pretty lucrative deals for these jihadist groups for them to cede territory to, the Emirates or what they call the Yemeni government. All right, I think that about does it for my coverage of Yemen here. I just, always want to add too is that I've, really focused in most of the, statements on Yemen focus on the fact that, people are starving to death and, people are killed by airstrikes. But, to look at even from, just a couple what we would consider lesser issues that I think, looking at long term are probably very catastrophic for Yemen is that you've had, 4 years now of war where, you have millions of kids not able to go to school either because their school's blown up or it's too dangerous. You've certainly had hundreds of thousands of people die. And so, that means people who lose loved ones and, that's a traumatic experience. Looking at all these kids who are just malnourished. And even if they don't end up being a stat in the death category, I mean, thinking about, what we know about how important like prenatal care is and, taking vitamins for kids and, all this kind of childhood development stuff that, when you're in a just survival mode, when you're in we could only eat one meal every other day, or else we wouldn't be able to live, this is the bare minimum. This is what we could do. Then, the development, there's going to be, long-term deficiencies and really bad things that come from this. All the infrastructure that's been destroyed and is going to have to be over time rebuilt. Kind of the long-term, kind of power balances, this is a very tribal country in Yemen and just different power sharing deals that have been maybe worked out before the war, of course, all, crumble and fall apart during the conflict. And so, there's a very long road back for the people of Yemen, but any step in that direction towards ending this war is a good thing and getting the Saudis to ramp down their war. And man, I know even if this passes, there's going to be ways for the U.S. and the Trump administration to help the Saudi government. But any step we could get in, limiting any of those terrible things going on in Yemen is great. All right, so the New York Times apparently finally figured out that the Maduro government wasn't responsible for setting fire to the aid convoy that was trying to cross over on February 23rd. Now, if you had listened to Foreign Policy Focus, this isn't new news to you. And it's one of those things where when I saw the New York Times reporting it, I was wondering why it was a news story. And I thought, maybe it was an old story. But it turns out, I guess, that they finally caught on and they finally concluded that it was a Molotov cocktail from the opposition that actually set fire to the aid truck. Now, the reason this is really big news, actually, is that while Matt Blumenthal saying it and proving it is one thing, the New York Times saying it and proving it, means another thing to the 90-something% of people who are in no way aware of who Matt Blumenthal is and how, important work, comes from the, this anti-war journalist kind of community. And now there's a bunch of U.S. politicians, media groups, Marco Rubio, John Bolton, Mike Pompeo all came out and really said that one of the reasons we need to overthrow Maduro is because he burned this aid convoy. And now it turns out not to be true. And so that seems like there's maybe going to have to be some reckoning here. And, this seems like a real negative, for, this group. Hopefully, there's some people that actually hold these politicians accountable. You would think as much as the Democrats have looked to really call out the Trump and the Trump administration in any way possible, that they would be all over this. However, they've been pretty wishy-washy on the whole Venezuelan thing themselves. I mean, former DNC chair Debbie Wasserman Schultz, I think, was, down there with the regime changers. Glenn Greenwald points out in his article on this, I'm going to link to in the show notes page, that this isn't even anything new. that the same thing happened with the bridge closure that was, portrayed as, oh, Maduro is shutting down the bridge to prevent aid from getting in the country, to, oh, actually, this is a bridge that's never been opened up. It's always been closed off. And that it's really been portrayed that Maduro isn't allowing aid to get to his people when he does allow international aid to come into his country. And so they just lie about this kind of thing and omit so many important facts. And, it's no wonder why people think that Maduro needs to be overthrown and that he's terrible to his own people. It's because they think his government burns the aid convoy and closes the highway to prevent his people from getting food and medicine, when in reality that's not the situation at all. Now, the U.S. did withdraw all their embassy staff from Venezuela after Maduro and his government demanded that happen. Now, the Pompeo statement on this really suggested, or at least I think wanted to give the impression that this was done because the U.S. wanted to greater open up their options for Venezuela, maybe was veiled as a threat towards the Maduro government. It's possible that, this is a serious threat and that the U.S. is doing this because they want to start a more serious active regime change effort in Venezuela. Or is, just the Trump administration and Pompeo trying to save face after they realized they had to withdraw their embassy staff from Venezuela. While it certainly seemed that the, regime change dial in Venezuela may have gone down a notch or two, the sanctions war is still on. The U.S. is pressuring Indian companies to adopt and enforce U.S. sanctions against Venezuela. A major Indian oil company is now ending its business ties with Venezuela until U.S. sanctions are lifted. They import a good amount of Venezuelan oil and export Venezuela some kind of product that they need within the oil production process. And on the last show, I had talked a little bit about why the Indian oil, in particular, that market was important to Venezuela. And so if the U.S. is starting to turn up the screws here and getting some more pressure on Venezuela economically, it could create, more problems here down the road. And while, there's not maybe an active regime change measure right now, as conditions in Venezuela start to get worse, they could, turn the regime change dial up again. There's been an awful lot of other stuff going on in the media and even in the anti-war media, but the U.S. is continuing to carry out these operations that are provocative towards China, whether it's sailing a couple more ships through the Taiwan Strait, or now flying some B-52s over or near the, kind of airspace of Chinese claimed islands in the South China Sea. These are provocative, especially as the U.S. is looking to negotiate this trade relationship with China. And remembering that these things are going on at increased frequency are important in case there's ever some kind of confrontation with China. I think it was under the Bush administration that a U.S. spy plane collided with some Chinese aircraft and ended up going down. And so accidents do happen. The U.S. talks with the Taliban and Qatar and with a draft agreement, nothing signed, but a draft agreement that I guess both sides kind of tentatively say that they agree to. We don't have a copy of that tentative agreement, but the general points are reported to be that the U.S. is committing to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, and the Taliban are committing to not allow a jihadist presence in Afghanistan. It's speculated that there may even be a timeline for the U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan in this draft agreement. So, this seems really good and another positive step towards ending the war, although again, just like with Yemen, a long way to go. Another interesting story coming out of Afghanistan is apparently there were some U.S. and Afghan forces operating, I believe in the northeast of Afghanistan, came under fire from another Afghan security checkpoint, and then that site was bombed by the U.S., killing at least 6 Afghan forces. So, 17, 18 years into this war, and we still can't properly identify the enemy or, who's on whose side. All right, before I close out today's show, I just want to mention there's some big things kind of going on in North Africa. Apparently, Field Marshal Haftar's forces have conquered most of the country, and there's some concern that he may look to take Tripoli from the UN-backed government there. And I guess there isn't really a fighting force to oppose him if he would choose to do so. I've talked about on the show in the past how the Tripoli airport is frequently closed because they can't even, get the local militias under control, and, whoever is fighting on whose side at any given time in and around Tripoli isn't all under control of the, U.S.-backed UN government there. I don't want to just predict here or make it sound like that there's a potential for the U.S. to get involved in another conflict in Libya, this time against General Haftar, because he does have support from Western countries. I believe at one point the Emirates were even carrying out airstrikes with U.S.-made planes on behalf of Haftar. He has support from local governments like Egypt. Russia seems content with that government, and I believe he even received some recent medical treatment in France. And so you would assume that if the French were opposed to this guy's rule, they wouldn't have helped him get well. Algeria, the president there, who's been president since 1999, Abdulaziz Bouteflika is the best I could pronounce his name. If you just Google up Algeria, you'll see him there. Is saying that he's not going to seek another term as president and postponed elections that were planned for mid-April. From the reporting and, just kind of what I could tell from Twitter, it seemed like generally the opposition viewed this as a victory. They have been protesting recently, demanding that the president step down, although it doesn't quite signal a full transfer of power, or that the situation in Algeria will improve, as he, postponed elections as well, said he won't run again. Protests continue in Sudan, demanding that the president there step down. I saw a story recently that caught my eye, and that some of the opposition leaders were arrested for protesting. I think they were only held for like 7 days or something like that, so it wasn't like a long-term, indefinite sent off to Siberia situation, but there's a lot of government oppression of the opposition there, looking to really try to, I think, turn down the notches on their, attempt at getting a new government in Sudan. But the protest movement has been going on now for a couple of months. And then the Central African Republic, there's a growing humanitarian concern in that country. And anytime there's a growing humanitarian concern, you at least have to keep an eye on the U.S. military and State Department, because they like to use these situations to secretly exploit it and get involved. Ted Galen Carpenter writes in The American Conservative on this. I'm just going to link to this one in the show notes page, so you have a little bit of an idea of, what actually what's happening in the Central African Republic, as, it may become a bigger story in the months to come. Thanks everybody for listening to the show. LibertarianInstitute.org, immersionnews.com, minds.com/immersionnews, at KYAAALE on Twitter, Libertarian Union on Facebook, patreon.com/foreign policy focus.